Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. This event is part of the Festival of Ideas Online, which is a series of conversations with writers and thinkers from all over the world. You can watch more from the series on the Bristol Ideas YouTube channel and go to bristolideas.co.uk for more videos, audio and essays. I'm really happy to be speaking to Dr. Pragya Agarwal today about her new book, Hysterical, Exploding the Myth of Gendered Emotions. You'll find a link below from Waterstones where you can buy the book. So let me introduce myself. I'm Holly Tarquini. I'm the CEO of Bath Film Festival, and I am the proud founder of the F Rating, which is a feminist film rating designed to champion films directed and or written by women. With me is Dr. Pragya Agarwal, who is an academic and activist, a behaviour and data scientist, a journalist, a podcaster, and a parent. She is also the founder of the think tank, the 50% Foundation, which investigates women's rights around the world. Now, while the rest of us in lockdown were getting puppies and making sourdough, Dr. Agarwal released not one, but 3 books, which is ridiculous. They were Sway, which explored unconscious bias, Wish We Knew What to Say, which is about talking to children about race and racism, Motherhood, which explores the stigma around motherhood. And her latest book, which has just come out, is Hysterical, which explodes the sexist myths around human emotions. Pragya, welcome.
Thank you so much, Holly. It's such a pleasure to be here. And can I just say before we start, I love the idea of the F rating. That's just so fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, when I was reading your book, I was feeling a lot of emotions. I was mostly feeling enormously, furiously angry about how far we haven't come, really, when it comes to the liberation of both sexes, really, and how constrained we are by language and emotions. And I felt very sad as well that I've probably unknowingly gendered both of my teenage daughters. So let's start at the beginning and tell me why you wrote this book, how you came to writing it.
As you would know, as a creative, there is never that one moment of grand epiphany. You would like to believe that, but I think it's the simmering of ideas over years, the kind of parallel or other work that you do, those kind of links that are forming in the brain. So as an academic, I was looking at technology and how you can make personalized technologies more human-centered technology. And I was thinking about how we form models, which are knowledge. How do we capture human knowledge? And I was always wondering about how do we talk about human emotions, because computers in themselves can't really empathize or some other things that we associate with being human. And then, I mean, obviously, as a person, from a personal perspective, obviously, it's always been part of my life, being called too much or too emotional, oversensitive, or hysterical even at times. And this kind of language kind of becomes internalized, and you start believing these things about yourself, and you start wondering, why is it that feeling emotions, when does it become too much? When is it too much emotion? When is it being oversensitive? And what's wrong with it, feeling too much? So all this kind of personal, academic, research, political aspects of how what I was seeing around with how women were treated in politics, the kind of language that was being used in media, that's all that happened with Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and Theresa May. I was just kind of collecting all this information, reading this information, as you say, becoming angry at times, becoming sad and despondent at times as well. So all that kind of collated into this one idea. I was on this writing course just before lockdown in January 2020, and I was in my hotel room late at night, and it just kind of crystallized in this moment, and I wrote down the whole proposal in one evening, and that's where it comes from. It's a long answer to a short question.
That's amazing. And that you did you write all of those books in lockdown, or is it just that they got published in lockdown?
So Sway, it was commissioned in 2018. So I was writing it mostly to 2018, 2019. But a lot of the research had been done along the way. It is about crystallizing those ideas. And it still takes a lot of work to form a book out of those ideas and those research. So I wrote it through 2019, and it was getting published in early 2020, just when the pandemic and lockdown hit on the first week of April. And then I wrote Wish We Knew, which was also related to some of the work that I had been doing before about how do we talk to children about race and racism. And at that time, it seemed like such a I suppose, a time when we were talking about these things and more, which we should be doing more often anyway. And so I wrote that book. But early 2020, when I stopped writing Sway in 2019, I started thinking about the next idea. And that's when I started thinking about motherhood. So it was commissioned early 2020, but I wrote it through 2020, and then it got published in 2021.
Amazing. I'm very envious of how prolific you've been in lockdown. I feel as though I've grown a few sunflowers.
I didn't grow any sunflowers. And I was kind of trying to live up to those expectations of all those things on Twitter saying, look, Shakespeare wrote this play when he was in lockdown. And yeah,
you managed it.
The children.
So in Hysterical, I was really interested by what you're writing about language, and what really grabbed me was, if we don't have a word for it, can we feel it? And especially what you were saying about grief. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I find that notion really interesting about how much we, first of all, I think a lot of these discussions around emotions are very Western, Eurocentric and Westernized. So a lot of the research is being done in the US and UK. So obviously that is the framework that the researchers are working within. And so when we talked, and I talked about the universal facial coding theory, which was kind of proposed that everybody in all cultures had these universal facial expressions, and you could sum up the basic emotions in 6 or 7 emotions. And that has been disrupted again and again now, but it's still, technologies are built on those kind of basic coding as well. And that is very Eurocentric. So I started thinking about how do we talk about emotions in these words? And for instance, if I talk about dukh in Hindi, does that encompass how we talk about it in English? So if I say dukh in Hindi, what does it mean in English? Can I express it? And there was this really interesting research I read about a different culture, different community, where they did not have a word for grieving. And so the researchers who went there thought that people perhaps didn't experience sadness or grief, but they talked about wanting to kill somebody or cutting somebody's head off or beheading. And that was their expression of anger associated with grief. And the researchers who were there could not obviously come to terms, because our concept of language and words is formed from the way we've been brought up, what we think, our framework, our mental models of the world. So when the team, the couple who was researching, the woman, the wife of the wife actually fell down a ravine and died. And the man, the gentleman, he realized one day when he was driving around California that he could understand that notion of wanting to behead somebody, about the strong emotion of grief that was so overpowering that he could do that. And obviously he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't put it into action, because we have obviously framed by our legal notions and what's right and our ethical notions, and they're different according to culture as well. But suddenly it made sense to him about the way they felt grief was no different to how we could feel grief. It's just that we talked about it in a different way.
Yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost as though it gave him the liberation to feel that anger and it be okay, because he'd heard and learned the story about another culture feeling that when they feel grief. So my whole thing with the F rating is that if we can change the stories that we see on screen, we can change culture much quicker than we can change culture politically or socially, because those are really difficult changes to make. But the stories that we see and that we hear can change us in a moment. And it feels as though that's a really amazing, brilliant example. But also your book is talking about how the reverse is true, how language and the constraints of what is masculine and what are male emotions and what is feminine and what are female emotions also constrain both genders kind of almost equally. And so I was really interested in that with the chapter that I found the most interesting, which was your chapter about brain sex, and especially about the history of the science of brain sex. So can you tell me about that?
Yes, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because so many of our notions of men and women or gender and sex have been kind of reinforced by showing that men and women brains are very different, male or female brains are very different. And this has been talked about in media, and we have books like Men Are From Mars and Women From Venus, and men cannot cry, and I think women can't read maps or something like that. So this has kind of perpetuated this very, very strong binary divide, this line down the middle saying that men have a bigger hypothalamus, so they have better spatial reasoning abilities. And so, which kind of justifies that there are more men in science and construction and all kind of STEM domains, and women can't do that. But if you start looking at actually some of these research that has been done in neuroscience, it's a very fairly new thing. It's also very hard to do neuroscience research because it's lab-based, so you can't get people to do the tasks in real world and do an MRI or a magnetic resonance imaging. So you can only replicate that. And a lot of those studies are done on very small sample sizes as well. And so I was looking at the fact that a lot of these start from this belief that we are trying to prove something, right? So their hypothesis is that there is a basic difference between men and women's brains. And so it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy or kind of a cycle where you look for evidence that confirms your hypotheses because there's a bias in that. And also, none of these research studies really looked at the difference between the groups, so between men and between women, which can also be the case. So rather than just between men and women, these two groups, within the groups, the differences weren't really mapped. And so we didn't see whether these differences were very prominent or significant as well. And then there's other researchers who are doing really interesting work in how showing our brains aren't really composed of these discrete regions which engage in different parts or different activities, like one part of the brain is doing the mapping or spatial reasoning and one part is enjoying music. It doesn't work like that. Our brains are more interconnected. And so there's a mosaic theory of the brain which shows that actually our brains are more like mosaics. They're kind of like a spectrum, and different regions are interconnected and they're working together to do these activities. And it might be that some men are different from some women, or some women are also different from other women, and some men are also different from other men, but there is no clear indication that men and women are very different from each other. There's also this other research that has been shown that actually from a very young age, girls and boys are, when they're born new and when they're newborn and they're young, they don't show very different behaviors or reactions, but those become crystallized as they grow older. So by the time they're 9 or by the time they're 12, they start showing very, very different behaviors. And so we start showing that this shows that this is innate, rather than thinking that it's cultural conditioning that could be leading to these behaviors. Because as I've talked about in Wish We Knew, but also Sway and other research as well, that from developmental psychology perspective, children want to conform to their membership groups. So if they have a very clear idea, or if we give them indications or triggers or specific triggers saying that you are a girl and you're a boy, they start looking for cues to say, what do girls do? What do boys do? And they want to belong. Everybody has a need to belong. So this notion of membership becomes really strong. So they try and conform to those behaviors as well. So a lot of this is cultural conditioning, and our brains are very flexible, they're plastic. And we are now beginning to talk about neuroplasticity, which means that our brains are being molded throughout life as well. They are not innate, like fixed in a particular structure, which means that if our brains are being molded through our life, then all these cultural and social cues and the way a child is brought up and that they read, what they are taught, what language they hear, really shapes their beliefs as well. So when we do these experiments, we are believing that the differences we see are because they are innate, but not that the fact that they've been caused by environmental conditions or cultural conditions.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And I love that you can't teach an old dog new tricks is absolute nonsense, that old dogs, all of us, can learn new tricks all of the time. And actually it grows our brains.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. So talk to me about the gendering of emotions, about that. Give us a kind of broad overview of how emotions have been gendered.
So there's so much to it, but what I wanted to do, so the book is divided into 4 parts, and the first part is to really tease out what is an emotion, and in that I talk about the way that culture and society plays a role, the way that power plays a role as well, that we modulate our emotions to suit where we are in a position of hierarchy, to cause comfort to others. And so people who are lower down in the hierarchy have less opportunities or less privilege to explore their emotions, which might be uncomfortable to others. They have to stick to social norms. And then that section, I also talk about the notion of social norms, that these norms are set in our society, and we have to modulate our emotions according to that. And in that, I wanted to also talk about how we all experience the same emotions. So talking about brain was also one of the reasons was to think about, are men and women experiencing emotions differently? There is no evidence for that, which means that the difference lies in the way we modulate and express our emotions and the way these emotions are judged and evaluated by other people as well. So we might be experiencing the same anger, the same rage, the same frustration, the same sadness, but we are showing them or moderating them according to the norms that exist in society, these kind of the boundaries that are there. So if you look at the second part is looking at history, I was really fascinated to look at history and to see how did this come about? Because we can't really talk about where we are if we don't look at the history. So if looking at the Greek antiquities and looking at Aristotle and the Greek philosophers and all the other literature and art of that time, they don't explicitly talk about emotions. But if you look at that and analyze the scripts and how they talk about it, this dualism was very deeply embedded in society, that men and women are very different and they have very different roles. So yes, people broke norms. Yes, there were women who were involved in political domain. Yes, there were men who were doing different things, but they were seen as transgressive. And the norm was that men are rational, women are emotional, and emotions are inferior to rationality and logic and reason. And so men can control and modulate their emotions, but women are too weak to be able to moderate their emotions because we are fragile creatures and we get overcome by emotions and we can't help it. And so women have to be kept in the domestic domain, and they cannot be held responsible for important decisions and be in the political domain, which meant, and these are all men writing about these things because obviously, because they had more power and they were the ones who had the authority to do that. So they were there. We also see how there were some sthenic and asthenic emotions that come into play, which are some emotions are strong and some emotions are weak. Some emotions are positive, some emotions are negative. So everything is this kind of duality is embedded in it. And so anger and rage and all these things are strong emotions, so women can't handle them because they're fragile, but they're also negative if women express it. And they were related to influence. So if men experienced or expressed them, they increase their influence. But if women experience them or express them, that decreases that influence. And we still see that in our workplaces. And so we come to politics and we come to contemporary society and we talk about medieval England and we talk about witch hunt, which is also, I try to show in the book about how it's very much linked to women who were not conforming to the norms of how to be, what emotions to express, how to act. So the whole idea of social norms has really determined which emotions are, how emotions are gendered, who's allowed to express certain emotions and not, and how we modulate our emotions. And so we see that now reflected in so many examples every day about how that comes into. So things have changed, but not that much. We're still deploying that kind of gendered language.
Yeah, and the title of your book, Hysteria. So we know that the word hysteria comes from the Greek of womb, and it was because the womb moved about the body and controlled us and made us crazy, and that it is an innately gendered word in itself. And I loved the irony of the cure for hysteria in the previous 2 centuries were that women needed to have more sex, but only with men, as though men always have to be involved in women's pleasure, which is, and that, if you if you were unmarried or widowed, I think you said, then you were much more likely to be hysterical because you weren't having sex with men, and that sex with men was the thing that was going to kind of cure you and sort you out.
So I mean, this body was seen as abnormality because obviously men were the prescribing the medical diagnosis and treatment. They were the ones writing about it. So it comes from the word hystericos, which is very, very in the old. We see it in the Jason and the Argonauts, where with the king's daughters. 3 daughters who are unmarried are believed to be like hysterical or overcome by their emotions of passions, it's called. There's so much heat that's not being released like an animal. And so the diagnosis was they need to be either kept in the dark. Later on, hysteria was treated like that. Like we talk about the yellow wallpaper, isn't it? That is, women were treated to be kept away from all the pressures, kept away in a room and not let anything impact their emotionality, so that they could be tempered down and kept. I see it as women having to be kept submissive and passive, and one way of oppressing. So rather than thinking that it is the patriarchal forces and the oppression that's actually making them hysterical, you're prescribing the same treatment to them, which is very ironical. And so I think, yes, I think it is a very inherently gendered thing about how emotions, the expression of emotions, and it's very much linked to the body and not having autonomy on your own body as well.
Yeah, and we can see how badly that's going at the moment. Yeah, and which leads me to one of my favorite quotes in your book, which was, anger is penalized most in those who would be best served by it, and serves those who would be most threatened by it. And which I just think is so true, isn't it? That, and you talked a lot about the kind of intersectionality of who is allowed to be angry and express their anger, and that the more intersections you have, the less able you are to express your anger and not be judged for it. So if you're at the top of the pyramid of the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, middle-class, English-speaking Western man, then you can express anger all you want and nobody judges you for it. And then every layer that's added to that, whether it's race or sexuality, means that you are judged more for especially for anger, it seems. Would you say that anger was the number one?
Anger is a very gendered emotion, certainly, because it's one of those emotions that is linked to heat and the passions, and it is very strong emotion associations of being negative for certain people. And yes, absolutely, I wanted to talk about intersectionality because we can't homogenize these groups. Even when we are talking about men and women, there are different privilege and different layers of power within those groups as well. So people who are more marginalized, who are more on the fringes, who are more othered, have less kind of leeway in getting out of these normative behaviors. So, for instance, another quite gendered emotion is crying as well, because men don't cry and it's seen as that, and it's not a sign of masculinity. But because if you're a man, you still have more leeway, you get less penalized if you're crying, and you're still seen as, oh, he's very comfortable with his emotions, or they are showing their emotions. And for instance, sports people, men who are sportsmen, are allowed to show their emotions and cry on the pitch because they've already expressed their masculinity in trying to do this kind of big feat of athleticism. And so they're allowed to cry. But yes, anger, there's all these tropes of angry Black women exist as well. So Black women in particular are seen as very aggressive and intimidating. And so any sign of kind of emotion from them, or strong emotion, they're monitored a lot in terms of how they show emotions. And we've seen it not just with people who are not celebrities, but even in Serena Williams or Michelle Obama, they've talked about how they've been monitored and penalized for their anger. We know I've talked about Serena Williams, and we know that when she was penalized for showing anger on the court, while other people might be able to get away with the same kind of behavior. And then she was shown in this Australian cartoon or in an Australian newspaper like a child or like a toddler having a tantrum. And it's very much linked to these kind of tropes about where you are in this status hierarchy, basically. Within men as well, if you're a man of a different minority ethnic background, you are perceived to be more emotional or more inferior. As you said, there is a pyramid there. So yes, anger is certainly one of the most gendered emotions. Crying is another emotions which is very much gendered. And it's so important to talk about intersectionality whenever we talk about these differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And with what you were saying about the discrepancy between how men are judged. So yes, they're supposed to man up and boys don't cry, but yet when they do, we're often in complete admiration of it because they're being emotional beings and that's what we want from them. But you also mentioned how differently Amber Heard was treated in the trial compared to Johnny Depp. And how gendered that was by so many people. And I wondered if you could talk about that a bit.
Yes, I think, no matter what our individual beliefs, our opinions are about what, and nobody can know what really happened. So I don't have any opinion on that, but just looking at the way they were judged and the way their emotions were monitored and patrolled, and the kind of associations or judgments were placed on these, it's really exposed how, as a society, first of all, the way we treat trauma victims and the victims of domestic violence and the kind of behavior we expect from them, and we impose these expectations on them, and we don't understand how people process some of these emotions, and we expect that they would be very submissive or very passive or crying all the time. And if they show any defiance, or if they're standing up, or if they're showing any anger, like Amber Heard did during the trial, she was penalized for it, and she was disbelieved more than that, which was the key thing. And even after the trial, we heard from some of the jury members who said we could not trust or believe what she was saying, because one moment she was crying, one moment she was smiling, one moment she was doing that. So they really had this kind of framework of emotional expectations about how she would show. She would be a passive woman, she was a submissive woman, she would be broken, she would be crying all the time. And if she wasn't doing that, then that meant that she was at fault somehow, or she hadn't experienced the things that they were talking about. So yes, I think that really, really showed the way, first of all, we treat men and women, and even in a very objective framework or a domain like the legal domain, emotions play a huge role. When we think and believe that we are being really objective and they are being going just by evidence, it is not the case. So yes, I think that's just one of the examples which has been really eye-opening recently.
Yeah, absolutely shocking. I found the whole thing profoundly upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
And moving on to another thing which you mentioned in the book, which is, I think every woman and girl has experienced in their lives, which is being told to smile, that we are constantly, I hope that it's a bit better today than it was when I was a child, but I was always I grew up in London, and whenever I was walking around, and I smiled a lot, but if I wasn't for a millisecond, people would say, oh, cheer up, love, may never happen, give us a smile. Can you talk to me a bit about the gendering of the smile?
Yes, I mean, I think it's changed, but recently I did kind of an informal survey, and it wasn't to show that this was a scientific survey, but I just wanted to collect some data on Twitter to see, is it still happening? And actually 98% of the women, of quite a lot, who replied said, of all ages, said that they heard it almost every day from people. And I'm surprised about the 2%. And actually, somebody recently said, maybe those 2% just stay at home and never leave their homes, because who are these 2% people? But no, I think it is very much linked to how women are supposed to create comfort for other people and not cause discomfort. So I also wrote in the book about my 6-year-old going to the dentist, who the dentist was really kept saying she's not smiling, she's really miserable. And I was just really surprised. She looked confused because she was obviously nervous being at the dentist. And I was like, she doesn't have to smile. And later on, she asked me, Mommy, did I have to smile? Should I have smiled? I was like, no, you don't have to smile. And even while taking photographs, I have to keep reminding them and the photographers, you don't have to ask them to smile, because they can just be the way they are. You don't have. So we impose these expectations on girls from a very young age that they have to create comfort for others. And that is very much a gendered thing that is linked to power. So as I said, people who are lower down in the status hierarchy, and I think we'll all acknowledge the fact that there is a status hierarchy between men and women, which still exists today in terms of who has more power. And it is also very much linked to the notion of how women have to perform emotional labor to appease others. So I talk a lot about emotional labor, and that is something that you have to moderate or suppress your real emotions to create a good environment for others, to provide service to others. And so people in the service industry do that. So if you have air hostesses, or that's why a lot of service industries were women traditionally, and like nursing or those kind of industries where you have to provide comfort and care. And that is also very much a gendered thing, that women are expected to be warm and naturally maternal and caring and empathetic, all those kind of emotions, soft emotions. And that is the notion, asking people, the expectation from women and girls to smile is also linked to that. Is you are expected to provide emotional labor, do this labor to create a comfort for other people, and so that they don't feel like you're angry or you're upset, or is there something that they need to do to moderate, to comfort you. So I think it is a very much a one-way thing and a very gendered thing that still happens.
I'm so over it. I'm so looking forward to being a furious old lady.
And that is why this idea of, I used to be really baffled with the whole resting bitch face comment that we used to hear a lot, that this person has a resting bitch face. And I kept thinking, I just find that face quite normal, and I don't know why. And that is also a very gendered thing. It's about how that was associated with women. It was mainly, primarily about women, about that this woman has a miserable face, or this woman is a bitch, which is often a word used for women who are not conforming to the norms, or who are not providing comfort to others, who are aggressive or authoritative, or all those kind of typically, traditionally masculine attributes that men are applauded for.
Yeah, I'm so over it. But it brings us nicely onto women in power. So you, because I am myself proudly a difficult woman, and I think women in power are inherently seen to be difficult women. And, you know, all the portrayals like Devil Wears Prada, you know, whenever you've got female bosses, they're either girl bosses, which means that they have to look amazing, or they're bitches because they've got power and they're female. But it feels very pertinent today. So we're speaking the day after Liz Truss was elected to lead the Conservative Party, and you wrote about Hillary Clinton and the pressures of women in power. So talk to me a bit about those pressures that women in power have.
So if we look at history and we look at how the norms are defined and how the notion of leader is defined, it's very much linked to the traditional masculine attributes. So the traditional masculine attributes of aggressiveness, authority, dynamism, self-motivate, all those kind of things. And you're allowed to show anger in it, and you show that creates influence, that gives you power. Women were not traditionally seen as leaders because the feminine attributes don't make a good leader. So we still see in workplaces, women and in other domains, women face this double-bind bias where either they have to conform to these masculine attributes of toughness or aggressiveness to be seen as a good leader. But if they do, they still have to navigate the thin line where they still have to be maternal and warm and nurturing. Otherwise, they're called a bitch or a bossy for the same things that a man would be called a good leader. And we know from research that actually showing anger and showing emotional expression in the workplace or in politics increases a woman's influence, while for a woman, it decreases their influence. Especially in politics, I think it plays such a huge role. And if I looked at Hillary Clinton about how she was called ice cold, and she also talked about from a young age, she learned how not to show her emotions because that was supposed to be a line that she couldn't cross in because it was very much monitored and by other people, by society. And during the whole political campaigns that she was doing, she was called angry quite a lot whenever she raised her voice a little bit within the debates while other candidates were doing the same. She was, but also called ice cold as well, that she was not showing empathy, she was not warm. And after the elections, there was a research done and a survey done, and both men and women responded in huge numbers that although they considered her to be the better candidate and who won against the person that she didn't win, she was not likable enough to be elected president. So this notion of likability, it plays a huge role in how women are perceived in the political domain. Very quickly, they can be called unlikable or disagreeable, or the fact that they're not going to work with other people. So they have to take everybody along, but still be aggressive and authoritative. We saw that with Margaret Thatcher, no matter what our political opinions are about her, and that she was called unlikable quite a lot. But while being tough, we saw this with Theresa May as well. She was called robotic, but then when she cried at giving her speech at the end, she was picked up on that as well, that she had shown tears. So this is a very thin, tricky line. And I've been thinking about how we haven't heard that much about Liz Truss, but there is a lot that she's obviously kind of imitating or replicating a lot of the personalities or mannerisms of Thatcher that in her campaign. There's been a lot of media talking about her toughness, and she's talked about her toughness. I'm going to take a tough stance, or I'm very tough. And so she's coming across as this kind of no nonsense, tough person, straight talking, which are also very masculine attributes. So she's trying to appease to them. And there is also a media headline which said she's not a ditherer, which is also, women are called that they can't make up their mind. They're very ambivalent. And so they're not very good for kind of political leadership. So we'll see how it plays out. But this notion of gendering of emotions really disadvantages women in politics. And we've seen that again and again.
It disadvantages us across the board, doesn't it? We have the double whammy of, we can never be, the demands on us are always the opposites of each other. So we're wrong whatever we do. It's like motherhood, isn't it? You're wrong if you go to work because you're leaving your child at home. But if you don't go to work, you're setting an appalling example, and all of the thousands of other ones. Whereas, like you were saying about men, you're not supposed to cry, but actually if you do, we're going to really be sympathetic and like you even more. And if you're really angry, then that shows that you're powerful and strong. And I mean, I saw a headline today which said Bublé, the singer, is that how you pronounce his name?
He was thinking of leaving his career because he wants to be a full-time dad, and that was kind of applauded. And I was thinking, we don't talk about mothers having to be a full-time mom would be criticized or talked about in a very demeaning way, that they're not prioritizing their careers. But if they prioritize their career, then they're thought of as a bad mother. And we wouldn't see such a kind of a headline glorifying their decision. Even when we saw Serena's decision to drop tennis to give priority to her family, and she talked about, if I was a man, I wouldn't have to do that. There was a lot of criticism of the fact that she did that and that she was doing that. And why wasn't she being the boss babe that she is, and going on and trying to juggle everything and showing everybody that you can have it all. So there is this dichotomy that exists.
Yeah, you can't be right. I wanted to move on to your chapter about AI, and it's very depressing, frankly, about fembots and sexbots. And I think, so obviously there have been lots of examples in film of beautifully sexy female robots who, yes, sometimes like in Ex Machina, they become overwhelmed by anger and go berserk, but they're never simply complicated women. No. But the most depressing thing I found about it was that you said that it may be that in developing fembots and sexbots and making them very compliant, that actually it will make things worse for us organic women, because we will have to become even more repressed and even more compliant. I wondered if you could talk about that.
This is one of the most interesting chapters, and I'm glad you talk about it, because I haven't really talked about it much in the other talks. It seems like kind of an area we haven't really discussed much. I find that really fascinating about how, because technology is dominated by men, we still have Silicon Valley, we know that it's dominated by men, startups are dominated by men, and bias in these technologies, gender bias in particular, but also racial bias, but gender bias has been talked about quite a lot. I talked about it in Sway, that we know that voice assistants are modeled on this notion of women, again, providing emotional labor. They're modeled in a traditionally feminine voice and names, Alexa and all that, and the fact that they are there to provide comfort and service, which women are supposed to do in real life. So what it does is that I think the bias from real life, or our expectations and norms from real life, gets translated into technology, because ultimately they're trained on these data, and they are also designed by the people who carry these expectations and norms and biases, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously, but they get ingrained in them. When technology is embedded in society, it actually results in reinforcing some of those gender notions as well. So when you see around you that women are the ones who are doing this kind of labor in technology, then they can be expectations on organic or real women or non-technological women who are to provide the same service, because then that becomes the norm. That can become the norm as we are using more and more technology. There was also a very interesting research report done by United Nations, and there's been other research around it to show how actually when these voice assistants were designed, they never retorted or stood up to any kind of sexual harassment or abuse. And so the report was called "I'll Blush If I Could." So I think Alexa or Siri, when somebody gave a very sexually explicit command or any kind of abusive statement, the only thing they would say was, "I'd blush if I could," and never did anything kind of to retort or go, or some other voice assistants went silent and didn't do anything. So that is also showing the kind of misogyny that exists within the technological domain of designing that. And fembots and the sex robots are kind of leading on from that, about how they are there to mostly to serve and pleasure men, and their expectations around what an idealized woman should look like, which is passive and submissive and does everything to just fulfill their comfort and their emotional labor to comfort them. Basically, they're doing that because men find it difficult to engage with women who are more complicated and who might not do the same thing and who might stand up to them. And so they're turning to these robots where they can customize and personalize some of these emotions and behaviors as well, and request what they need in it. So yes, I think it's a very pessimistic outlook, but I think it's a question worth asking about what happens when these technology becomes more widely used, when these kind of robots, or when AI, which is gendered, emotional, in an emotional way, becomes more widely used. What happens to people and our expectations of people around us as well? And so that's something I think we need to talk about.
And I'm just going to quickly this isn't my normal stance, but I am jumping to the defense of men, just in that it's still quite a niche world, isn't it? Sex bots and fembots, and they're being designed by a very small number of possibly quite specific men. And so what we're talking about here is not all men.
No, not all men, hashtag.
Yes. But a niche of men, because of course there are also men who do like complex, difficult, loud, angry, complicated.
Absolutely. And I think it's
women.
with everything. It's not, whenever we're having these conversations, we are addressing and challenging how it can be affecting some people, but what happens if it becomes more widely used? What happens if it is widely available? Why is this happening? And again, besides these kind of robots, I think how they're portrayed in films is a more, I think, important matter, because those kind of representations are more widely seen and young people are seeing it. And if we think it's quite niche, but for writing this book, I had to troll a lot of forums, and I tell you, that was not a pleasant experience at all for me. And that made me realize I felt disillusioned with my life and everything for a little while. But there's so much to hope for. And I think the more we have these conversations, the more we can challenge some of these stereotypes as well. And I think AI in particular, I think we need to have more conversations around the ethical aspects of AI and about how the impact it has on society widely, from racial and gender bias perspective, but from other perspectives as well. How does it serve the marginalized communities, and what it does to them, and what it does to us, and how we use them and how we deploy them is really important to talk about.
I think that is the perfect place to stop, is that, yes, we need to have far more conversations, and we need to have far more diversity in the worlds that are designing AI and working with AI. Dr. Agarwal, that's been just fantastic. Thank you so much for talking to us about your book, Hysterical. And anybody that's listening can find a link below to Waterstones where they can buy the book, and do watch more stuff on Bristol Ideas. And thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.